In the early 11th century, Western Europe was a world of kings, dukes, rival nobles, and shifting alliances. In Normandy, on the northern coast of what is now France, power could change quickly. A ruler could die, a claim could be challenged, and an entire territory could be thrown into conflict. And in this uncertain world, one boy would be born with almost every reason to doubt his future. He was born outside of formal marriage, a circumstance that could make his position dangerously weak in medieval society. Yet somehow, this boy would survive years of political struggle, rise to become Duke of Normandy, and eventually cross the English Channel to claim the crown of England. His name was William. History would remember him as William the Conqueror. But how did a boy who began life with almost every reason to fail become one of the most powerful rulers of his age? If you enjoy well-researched historical documentaries told in clear, simple English, please consider subscribing to Chronicle in English and staying with us throughout this journey. And as the story unfolds, if something catches your attention or you have a thought about the events we uncover, share it in the comments. Now let's begin. William was born around 1027 or 1028 in Falaise, Normandy. The exact year is uncertain because records from this period do not give us a definite birth date. His father was Robert I, Duke of Normandy, a powerful Norman ruler. His mother was Herleva, a woman from Falaise who was not married to Robert. Because William was born outside of formal marriage, his enemies would later use his birth against him. But Robert recognized William as his son, and when Robert had no surviving legitimate son, he chose William as his successor. There was only one problem. William was still a child. In 1035, Robert died while returning from a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. William was only about 8 years old when he inherited the title of Duke of Normandy. But being given the title did not mean he was safe. Normandy was filled with powerful nobles who wanted influence over the young ruler. Some claimed to protect him, others wanted to control him, and some wanted to remove him completely. Several men close to William were murdered as rival factions fought for power around him. For years, William survived in an atmosphere of suspicion and violence. Then, as he grew older, the danger became even more direct. In 1046, William's enemies began plotting against him. Their plan was to seize the young duke and take control of Normandy. The danger became clear when William traveled to Valognes. He discovered that his enemies were preparing to capture him. William had no army large enough to fight them, so he fled. He rode through the night, desperate to escape before his enemies could catch him. Eventually, he reached safety at Falaise. But William understood that he could not spend the rest of his life running from his enemies. He needed help, so he turned to the most powerful ally available to him, King Henry I of France. Henry agreed to support the young duke. Together, they prepared to confront the rebellion. William had escaped with his life. Now he was returning with an army. King Henry I of France had agreed to support the young Duke of Normandy, and together they moved against the nobles who were trying to overthrow William. The rebellion was not simply a fight between two armies. William's position as duke was still weak, and several powerful Norman nobles believed they could take control of Normandy while he was young and inexperienced. Among the leading rebels was Guy of Burgundy, a powerful noble who had once been close to William. Now he wanted the duchy for himself. William could not allow that. If the rebellion succeeded, he could lose Normandy entirely. In 1047, William and King Henry brought their forces together and marched against the rebels. The two sides met near Caen, at a place known as Vallès-Dunes. William was still a young ruler, but this was no longer a fight he could escape from. He had to prove that he could defend his own authority. The battle began with the two armies facing each other across the battlefield. William's forces attacked the rebel army, while Henry's troops supported him. The fighting was fierce, but the rebel forces eventually began to lose their formation. As their resistance weakened, William's army pushed forward. The rebellion was defeated. Guy of Burgundy escaped from the battlefield, but William had achieved what mattered most. He had survived. More importantly, the victory changed the way the nobles of Normandy saw him. William was no longer simply the young duke who had inherited his father's title. He had now shown that he could fight for his position and win. After Vallès-Dunes, William's position in Normandy became much stronger, but he still had powerful nobles who could challenge his authority. Over the following years, William dealt firmly with opposition and strengthened his control over the duchy. He also built a more reliable military force and a stronger administration, making it increasingly difficult for his rivals to threaten his rule. Then, around 1051, William married Matilda of Flanders, the daughter of Baldwin V, Count of Flanders. The marriage brought William an important political alliance and connected him to one of the most influential families in Northern Europe. As William's authority grew, Normandy became more stable under his rule. The young duke who had once fled for his life was now firmly established as one of the most powerful rulers in northern France. His reputation was spreading. His military strength was growing. And beyond the shores of Normandy, a new opportunity was beginning to appear. That opportunity lay across the English Channel in the Kingdom of England. At the center of the English kingdom was Edward the Confessor, its king. Edward had spent part of his early life in Normandy before returning to England and becoming king in 1042. His long connection with Normandy brought him into contact with William, Duke of Normandy. But Edward had no surviving children. And as he grew older, an important question became impossible to ignore. Who would inherit the English crown after his death? William later claimed that Edward had promised the throne to him. According to William's account, Edward had given him the assurance that after his death, the crown of England would pass to the Duke of Normandy. If that promise was genuine, William believed he had a strong reason to expect the English throne. But William was not the only man with a powerful claim. In England, there was another man whose position was almost impossible to ignore. His name was Harold Godwinson. Harold was one of the most powerful men in England. He belonged to the influential Godwin family and was the Earl of Wessex, controlling enormous wealth and commanding the loyalty of many English nobles. Unlike William, Harold was already deeply connected to England. He had spent years at the center of English politics. And this is where Harold's story became connected to William's. At some point before 1066, Harold traveled to Normandy. The exact circumstances of his journey are debated, but Harold eventually came under William's control. William later claimed that Harold swore an oath supporting William's right to become King of England. The oath became extremely important. To William, Harold had given his word. But Harold's position in England was changing rapidly. Then, in January 1066, Edward the Confessor died. There was no surviving son to inherit the throne. England now needed a king. The English nobles chose Harold Godwinson. He was crowned King of England. For Harold, the decision meant securing the kingdom's leadership at a moment when England could not afford uncertainty. But in Normandy, the news was received very differently. William believed the crown had been promised to him. And now the man who had supposedly sworn to support his claim was sitting on the English throne. When news of Harold's coronation reached William, the dispute became a crisis. William accused Harold of breaking his oath and taking a crown that William believed belonged to him. But William could not simply cross the Channel and demand England. He knew that claiming the English crown was one thing. Taking it was another. He began preparing for the invasion. Across Normandy, ships were gathered and new vessels were built. Soldiers were recruited, horses were collected, and supplies were loaded for a campaign across the English Channel. William also needed more than soldiers. He needed the support of powerful nobles who were willing to risk their lives and fortunes for the invasion. By the end of the summer of 1066, a large Norman force was assembled. Then William crossed the Channel. His army landed at Pevensey, on the southern coast of England. From there, they moved toward Hastings, where William established a base and waited for Harold. But Harold was already facing another crisis. Before William's invasion, a different army had invaded England from the north. Harold's own brother, Tostig, had joined forces with Harold Hardrada, king of Norway, to challenge Harold's rule. Harold marched north with his army and met them at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. The battle was brutal. Harold defeated the invading Norse army, and both Hardrada and Tostig were killed. But the victory came at a cost. Harold's army was exhausted, and William was still waiting in the south. When news reached Harold that the Normans had landed, he had little time to rest. He gathered his surviving forces and marched south again. The two armies were now moving toward the same destination, Hastings. William had crossed the sea to take England. Harold had already defeated one invading army and was now facing another. Everything would be decided on a single battlefield. On October 14th, 1066, William and Harold would finally meet. On a hill near Hastings, two armies prepared for a battle that would change the history of England. At the top of the hill stood Harold Godwinson's English army. Harold's soldiers formed a tight defensive wall, locking their shields together and creating a barrier that was difficult to break. Below them stood William's Norman army. William had brought three main forces: archers, infantry, and cavalry. The Normans began the attack. First came the archers. They fired volleys of arrows up the hill, trying to weaken the English shield wall. But the English held their position. Then Norman infantry advanced. They climbed the slope and attacked the shield wall directly. Again, the English resisted. The hill gave Harold's soldiers a strong defensive position, and every Norman attack had to fight its way uphill. For hours, William's army struggled to break through. Then something unexpected happened. Part of the Norman army began retreating. Seeing the Normans falling back, some English soldiers broke formation and rushed down the hill to pursue them. It seemed like an opportunity to destroy the retreating enemy. But William's retreat was turned into a weapon. The Norman soldiers suddenly turned around and attacked the Englishmen who had left the shield wall. Many of them were cut down. The English formation was weakened. William now understood that the same tactic could be used again. The Normans launched another attack. Again, some English soldiers pursued the retreating troops. Again, the Normans turned and struck back. Slowly, the English defensive line began to lose its strength. But Harold's men still refused to surrender. The battle continued into the afternoon. William's archers kept firing. His infantry continued attacking. His cavalry repeatedly charged the English position. And gradually, the shield wall began to break apart. Then came the moment that changed everything. Harold was killed. The exact circumstances of his death are debated, but his death destroyed the center of English resistance. Without their king to lead them, the English army began to collapse. Some soldiers continued fighting. Others fled into the surrounding countryside. William's army pushed forward until the English resistance was finally broken. The Battle of Hastings was over, but England had not yet been conquered. William had defeated Harold's army, but large parts of the country were still outside his control. The English had lost their king, yet resistance had not disappeared. William therefore moved carefully. Instead of immediately rushing toward London, he secured the areas around Hastings and then began advancing through southern England. As his army moved forward, some towns surrendered rather than risk destruction. But London was different. It was the political center of England, and whoever controlled London had a much stronger claim to control the kingdom. The English nobles gathered to decide what to do next. They eventually recognized that continuing the war against William would be extremely difficult. Their armies had already suffered heavy losses. Harold was dead, and William's forces were still advancing. One by one, the remaining English leaders submitted. William had won the military struggle. Now he needed to turn victory on the battlefield into legitimate royal authority. On Christmas Day, 1066, William entered Westminster Abbey. There, before nobles, clergy, and the people of England, he was crowned King of England. The crown that he had claimed belonged to him was finally placed upon his head. William had won the crown, but England was not yet willing to accept him. Across the country, rebellions continued to break out. English nobles who had lost their lands resisted Norman rule, while communities in different regions refused to recognize William's authority. William responded with force. His army moved through rebellious territories, defeating resistance and destroying strongholds that challenged his rule. But William understood that military victories alone would not be enough. He needed a permanent system of control. One of the most important tools was the castle. The Normans built castles across England, often in strategic locations overlooking towns and important roads. These were not simply homes for soldiers. They were centers of military power, designed to discourage rebellion and allow William's forces to respond quickly when resistance appeared. William also transformed the ownership of land. Many English nobles who had opposed him lost their estates. Their lands were given to Norman supporters who had fought alongside William. Within a generation, much of England's ruling class had been replaced by Norman nobles. The change reached the church as well. William brought Norman bishops and abbots into important positions, strengthening his authority while connecting England more closely to the Norman church. Government also became more centralized. William demanded loyalty from his nobles and expected them to provide soldiers when the crown needed them. England was becoming a kingdom in which the king held enormous authority over land, military service, and government. The Norman conquest also changed the country's culture. The ruling class increasingly spoke Norman French, while ordinary English people continued speaking forms of Old English. Over time, the two languages influenced each other, leaving a lasting mark on the English language we speak today. The changes were enormous. England's political system had been reshaped. Norman rule was firmly established, and William now held greater control over the kingdom than any English king before him. But controlling England required more than soldiers and castles. William needed to know exactly what he now possessed, and that led to one of the most remarkable projects of his reign. To understand the kingdom he now controlled, William ordered one of the most ambitious surveys of medieval Europe. The work began in 1085. Royal officials traveled across England, recording information about landowners, estates, livestock, property, and the value of land. The result became known as the Domesday Book. It was an extraordinary record of England's wealth and land ownership. For William, it was more than a record. It gave the crown a clearer picture of what each landowner possessed and what they owed to the king. For landowners, the survey meant greater royal oversight and clearer financial obligations to the crown. The Domesday Book therefore strengthened William's administration and helped him exercise tighter control over the kingdom. But by this stage of William's reign, another question was beginning to emerge. What would happen to the kingdom after him? William's sons were growing older, and the future of his territories would soon depend on them. When William died in 1087, his lands were divided among his sons. Robert Curthose, his eldest son, received the Duchy of Normandy. William Rufus, his second surviving son, received the Kingdom of England and became King William II. His youngest son, Henry, did not immediately inherit either kingdom. Instead, he received money and lands. But Henry's story was not over. After the deaths of his brothers, Henry would eventually become ruler of both England and Normandy. William had left behind a powerful dynasty and a kingdom transformed by Norman rule. His conquest changed England's ruling class, castles, government, church, culture, and language. The boy who had once fought simply to survive had become the ruler who reshaped an entire country, and his influence would continue long after his death. William the Conqueror's story did not end with his death. The kingdom he created continued to evolve, and the Norman influence he brought to England would shape the country for centuries. His story is ultimately a reminder that history can be changed by people who begin with almost impossible odds. William began as a vulnerable young duke. He ended as the ruler who transformed England. And that is the legacy of William the Conqueror. If you enjoyed this documentary, please like the video, subscribe to Chronicles in English, and share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching. Until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and remember, history helps us understand the world we live in today.